Captain Richard Henry Pratt started the Carlisle Indian School in 1879. He was a military man, and he believed that it would be better to try and bring Indian children far from their homes, sever them from their families, from their communities, and assimilate them into the white man's ways. So that was really the purpose of the Carlisle Indian School. So it operated until 1918, so about 40 years, with over 8,000 children coming from virtually every nation from across the country.
I am Dr. Roberta Paul, but I go by Dr. Robbie Paul, and my Indian name is Tulikalisima, woman of the forest of the Nez Perce Nation from Idaho. My grandfather, Jesse Paul, arrives here February 20, 1880, as a very young man at the age of 10, along with 6 other Nez Perce children from the exile camp in Oklahoma, Tawanka, Oklahoma. And he was recruited by Pratt to come here to learn about how to be assimilated.
One of the recruitment tactics by Pratt was to convince parents to send their children that if they learned English, that they could better negotiate the treaties that their people were having with the U.S. government.
A great-grandmother, Phoebe, she witnessed 5 children dying, and her only surviving child was Jesse. So how do you send your only surviving child to a boarding school and not even knowing where that's at? How did Jesse go on? I mean, he was a little boy, and he witnessed all those deaths too. So how does a little boy witness those deaths, witness his father's death, go away, far away to school, far, far away, and never to see his mother? Maybe or maybe not. He didn't know if he's going to get to see her again. That's a pretty unknown at that time.
So typically students were enrolled for 3 to 5 years, and when they first arrived, many of them coming thousands of miles from their own home communities. Via train, boat, they would arrive in Carlisle, and among the very first things that happened would be the cutting of their hair, which was also a sign of emasculation, particularly for the men, and a sign of grieving, right? That often your hair was cut if you were in mourning.
Coming here in Carlisle, for him, coming from the west, from a war, and coming here to where there were brick buildings and brick sidewalks, trolleys, that had to have been really eye-opening. I don't know how scared he was or how he felt to be transformed when he immediately came, to have his hair cut and put into a uniform, given a lye bath. I'm sure that must have not felt good.
They were also stripped of their native clothing, if they came in native clothing, and were put into military uniforms, girls into dresses. They were taught not to speak their own language. And students came from all sorts of nations from across the country and spoke different languages, but they would be punished if they were speaking their own language. So there really was an attempt to sever themselves not only from their families and their home communities, but from their language, from their culture.
Our grandfather Jesse arrives as Kakune, Black Raven, and Pratt had written it out and signed his name, and he says now he is known as Jesse Paul. So that was a transformation from our Indian name to an English name, and so that was pretty profound.
So some of the children, after they left Carlisle, went back, in Pratt's term, to the blanket. They went back to their home communities. Some were able to really reintegrate themselves back into those communities, but for many they were in limbo. They were neither white nor native in the sense that they didn't remember the language. You know, if you're here for 3 to 5 years not speaking your own language, many would return home, and there's some very sad stories about meeting their parents or their grandparents and not being able to talk with them, or having difficulty adjusting to the conditions at home.
He leaves here in June of 1888 and goes home to the Nez Perce Reservation. I do know when he comes back home and does the land surveying and starts the ranch with his wife, and she had gone to boarding school too, they keep the children at home and they teach them all Nez Perce. They all speak fluent Nez Perce, so they didn't get rid of the language as Pratt wanted them to do.
That sense that you are less worthy, or that you're inferior, that you're not good enough who you are, but that you needed to learn a new language, have a new name, to dress and to eat in different ways, And especially, I think the most difficult part was being taken from their families, so that they didn't have the kind of nurturing and love and care that parents and grandparents and an extended community would often give. So that sense of love and caring just wasn't a part of the Carlisle Indian School or boarding schools in general. And that is also what kept many from being able to nurture their own children. So there is a process of intergenerational trauma that's been passed down many generations that many Native Americans are talking about.
The importance for me to come here was to really retrace the roots and to retrace, for me, part of my healing model for me was to go where the wound occurred, and this was a big wound of boarding school, of being transformed into something that you weren't. And so I just wanted to find out how the process happened, where he went, touch the ground where he walked on, and maybe get a feel of how it was for him to be here as a young man, as a young person, and that transformation that he went through.
I think one of the most important things is, particularly the third generation, the grandchild generation, of wanting to learn more about that history, asking grandparents or doing a lot of writing and research about what was it like. I think often it's the child generation. The parent generation may not be talking, that often the stories or the experiences were so painful they didn't want to talk about the experience. But I think in terms of the healing, it's in part coming back, being on these grounds, and being able to tell their grandparents' stories and the ways in which the Indian school also impacted them and their parents.
But that was a particular hard part of our family history, a very hard part. So, but I think he probably had to reflect on, well, I survived a war, I can survive this too. He had to pull those together. He had to pull it from somewhere. He had to have a spiritual strength to do that. And so that's what I rely on as our spiritual strength too, that he's given it to us to survive and to thrive.
But I think making that history known, of countering the narrative, Pratt's narrative, the unified narrative that was told by government and school officials, that this was a benevolent, progressive experiment, which in some ways it may have been for its time. On the other hand, it clearly was a form of genocide. If you look at the UN definition of genocide, this clearly fits in with that definition. It's not just the killing off of people or the massacring of a village in the Indian wards, but it's also taking children away from their home communities and separating them and teaching them a whole new way of being, or attempting to teach them a whole new way of being. So I think that's where some of the healing is coming from. And of course, in order to tell their stories, they have to have people who are willing to listen. So that's the responsibility of all of us. How do we engage in a dialogue? How do we listen to these stories of anger and frustration and pain and know that my ancestors had a role to play in that? So this isn't just a one-sided history, this is a history for all of us.
We are all human beings on this one planet, and how are we going to move together as a humanity? And as we listen to each other and understand each other, as we hear each other's stories from each continent, each culture, we can heal and move forward. But we're a ways from being healed as a humanity. So, but that's how I've dealt with it.